So you'll notice on the dot between 31 and 1, this is only seen on first and second series. With the third and fourth series, there's no dot between 31 and 1.
Ah, okay.
Once you see that, you can't unsee it, and it's changed my life. Welcome back to the Collectability Podcast. Before we get started, I have a favor to ask. Please push that subscribe button on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and this will ensure the future of this channel. So if you love Patek Philippe content, please push that button now. And also, please continue to comment below. We very much appreciate it. Today, we're joined by Tony Traina, former Hodinkee editor who before was a practicing media and technology attorney. In 2019, he started a newsletter, which I remember well, called Rescapement. And in 2022, joined Hodinkee full-time. Along the way, he gained thousands of fans, including me, read every word. And he's written some of the most interesting, informative, and insightful articles that the watch world has seen in recent years. Tony has recently gone off on his own and started working on his new newsletter called Unpolished. And there's a link below. If you haven't subscribed already to Unpolished, it is a must do. So I encourage our listeners to sign up below. It's frankly not to be to miss because there's just so much content that he's sharing and so many storylines that the watch world is not yet looking closely at until you came along. Tony's also written in the past for GQ, Sotheby's, Revolution, and A Collected Man. And now I'm honored to say that Tony is writing for Collectability, and his first long-form article for Collectability has already made waves in the watch community, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And that is your 3970 Collector's Guide. All that said, welcome, Tony.
John, thank you so much for far too kind of an introduction to what I must say is the podcast with the best introductory music. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, thank you for pointing out the music. That's beloved for us. So before we dive into all things 3970, I just have a couple questions to ask you. Why leave a job at a big law firm to dedicate your life to writing about watches?
Yeah, I had practiced as an attorney for 4 or 5 years. I had a good job, but I had really fallen in love with watches, something you relate to. But even before that, I had loved the writing process, creative writing, worked for my student magazine or student newspaper back in college, worked in a law review during law school. I had always loved the creative writing process. Part of the reason I became an attorney is because I love writing. But I, started having opportunities to combine those two interests of mine, writing and then writing about watches. And I'd become sort of a passionate enthusiast, collector, whatever you want to call it. And I'd been doing it on my own and then on a freelance basis for a handful of places. So when Hodinkee came knocking at the door mid to late 2022, it seemed like an opportunity I would always regret if I didn't at least try it out, making a full-time go of it in watches, especially for kind of the name that created so many opportunities or kind of just changed the nature of watches and watch media, at least here in the States.
So what's an average day like for you now that you're out on your own? Like you're all over social media. If you Google anything about watches, you find Tony Traina. So what's your average day like today?
I'm not sure that's true, but I'll take it anyway, John. So thank you for that. I like to wake up early, get a cup of coffee, and then I do my best writing in the morning for the newsletter. I publish a couple of newsletters a week. So especially on those days, I'm writing and then proofreading and putting the finishing touches on a newsletter, or I'm working on a project or an article for someone like you, writing the 3970. And then obviously a lot of meetings take place on Swiss time. So by late morning, I've got a couple of meetings or calls with folks in Switzerland, people I know at brands or collectors, whatever it is. And then you kind of know how it is. I think this is one of the things I didn't quite grasp when I kind of set out to be a solo entrepreneur, for now at least, is so much of the second half of the day is administrative stuff that I think anyone with a job or a business can relate to. Emails, appointments, invoices, whatever it is. And that's so much of the second half of the day, but I find myself sort of most creative or most productive in the morning. So that's when the real action happens.
What other brands are you writing for or have written for? I'm very curious on like some of the Swiss brands, for example?
Yeah, I've written for a few brands, helping with like press and comms, especially in the lead up to Watches and Wonders. But I really enjoy some of the smaller brands I've worked with as well, because it's not just doing PR and comms. It's doing more sort of like, it feels a little more consultative. Like while you're at it, like we would also like your sort of input on the product itself, and you kind of are engaged in seeing what the product is like a little bit earlier on in the product development process and all of that. But the ones I enjoy the most are more editorial focused, kind of like what I've done for you. I've done some writing for Sotheby's, and it's obviously through a commercial lens at the end of the day. But you're able to, it's editorial primarily, and you're able to put your own spin on things, have a point of view, and translate that into an article or content or whatever it is.
So I'm imagining you walking into some of the great houses in Switzerland, and yesterday you had the opportunity to go to Collectability. So how was your day at Collectability that you spent with us yesterday? I'm just curious on first impressions and what that experience was like.
I think the best part was in the afternoon when you started bringing out the trays of watches. For those who don't know, dealers such as John store watches in kind of bubble wrapped Ziploc bags, and they kind of just keep coming out for, at least at Collectability HQ. There's the Calatrava tray, and then there's the modern tray, and then there's the vintage complications tray. And you think it's over, but then another one comes out. And then I think the other fun part was actually you have a watchmaker who comes to your shop, at least, or your HQ, at least a day or two a week. I don't know what it is, but yesterday when we were there, he had a couple of Beta 21s, which I know is a watch you love. And they both weren't functioning or needed a service. So seeing him open those up, trying to get them running, installing a new battery, figuring out, as he said, the movement, even for a quartz or electronic movement, it's quite a mechanical thing. I mean, it is 50 years old or whatever it is at this point. So it's quite a mechanical thing that you kind of have to think through logically as a watchmaker still to get it working. And he was able to easily change the battery in one and get it working with a little bit of elbow grease, basically. The other one he couldn't get working right away, and he said he kind of needs a full cleaning and service. So it was interesting to see that watch specifically, and then the process of having a watchmaker on site for you
and seeing behind the scenes. I feel like a watchmaker should be your first eyes at intake because they're looking so objectively.
Yeah.
Like I'm thinking of like value and history, and which are very important. But a watchmaker is just thinking, okay, proper function. And that, I think we are so fortunate to have amazing watchmaking support.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. Whether it's a Beta 21, and I don't know how much those are, versus 3970, which we'll talk about. It's the same evaluation process at the end of the day.
That's true. For the first time, the Collectability podcast, we're going to do a podcast around a reference, the 3970. And what better way to kick that off is with you. Tony and I started discussing this whole idea of doing an article, a long-form article, collector's guide on the 3970. I think it was back in, late 2024. It was late last year. And we shared our ideas of what references would be the most interesting. And the 3970 was the best way to kick things off for a number of reasons. And last month, Tony gave me a call, and we went through his outline and the details that he was looking to put into this article. And it was, how long? The conversation about an hour long.
I took up too much of your time, probably.
Not at all. No, the conversation, I have to say, was one of the best conversations I've had around a reference number in my life. Because you had so much new information that I was learning. I had a few things that you didn't know, and we put it together, and that's the result of this article. And that conversation I want to capture today in the Collectability podcast to share with our listeners. And hopefully you'll think of the 3970 in a bit different light. We'll share some of the inside baseball stories of the discoveries that were made along the way, and some of the problems too that we came across, because sometimes scholarship is not black and white when we're even looking at watches from the recent history. So I'll kick it off and why did you want to start with the 3970?
I love the watch, first of all. I mean, it's that simple, and I hope that sort of passion comes through in the article. I have thoughts on the watch itself and why I like it, but then sort of specific iterations that are the dream 3970 for me. And I'd always wanted to put pen to paper on it, and obviously what better way and what better resource than you and collectability. I've had a passing interest in it for years, read about it, have friends with examples, 3970s, 71s, always loved seeing them. But to add the firsthand perspective of you and Tanya made it just a lot of fun to write about. I can't remember the first time I tried one on, but it was the first. I like relatively simple watches, but it was the first complicated watch I remember trying on and being like, oh, wow, this is a beautiful experience on the wrist. Number one, it wears super well. It wears like a Calatrava or something like that, 36 millimeters. So there's just the ergonomic experience, but then it manages to communicate so much information in such a clean way in that 36 millimeters in a way that feels great on the wrist that I was smitten immediately. And I think as you put it to me later, it's kind of the unobtainable obtainable reference, or obtainable unobtainable, however you want to say it, where it's something you can aspire to if you do relatively well in life, in the way that even some of its predecessors are out of reach for most people nowadays. This is something that you can kind of still aspire to own. And for that reason as well, it's kind of something that I always wanted to have my sights on. And then as you dig more into the era of Patek Philippe and the 80s and 90s that we talk about, it tells that story in a way that I find extremely compelling as well.
Now, how do you think of the 3970? I think of it as basically a modern watch, but you might have a different take. How would you describe the 3970 era?
Yeah, obviously there's the term neo-vintage. I think modern vintage is a term I've seen you use to describe some of this era of watches in the 80s and 90s, because it's modern in most senses of the word, in the way it uses, technology and stuff like that. It's got a pad printed dial. It doesn't have this, hard engraved enamel that we associate with 40s and 50s mid-century Patek Philippe. So it's a modern vintage watch, but it kind of has that classical appeal and aesthetic that I think as you move further into the modern era, a lot of the modern watches don't have as much. So it's this nice bridge between the two in a way that captures the best of both worlds.
Yeah, and coming up on, easily 30 years plus. I mean, this has been with us.
Right. I mean, this is how we start the article, right? Yes. 1986 is almost 40 years ago now.
I can't believe it. It's because it feels like yesterday for me. So, it's really extraordinary.
Yeah.
And talking to younger collectors, I mean, they often just say this is a vintage watch in their mind. I consider it modern, but I think the compromise is modern vintage is a fair way to describe the 3970. And sometimes, and I think a lot of the market is thinking the same way, this is where some of the best values in collecting are. And we're going to wrap up our conversation with the values of 3970s after we dive back into the history. So a couple words on the lineage. Where did the 3970 come from a design perspective?
I feel like you should be giving this part of the talk, but I'll give it briefly, right? So the 1518 was introduced in 1941. Please fact check me as I try to do this live.
Absolutely, 100%.
So. And there were, how many 1518s were made?
280.
Okay. And then that was produced for about a decade until the 2499 came to be in 1950 or 1951. And there were 349 of those made until about 1985, which is when the 3970 came in. It was introduced in 1986, a year after what I think of as the sister reference, the 3940, as kind of these modern complicated watches that really brought Patek into the modern era in a way. So that's the lineage. You can see the kind of the design is all there as well. And those are the first two before it.
The design language of the 3970 is just so Patek Philippe. You look at it from across the room and you know exactly what it is. And one of the questions that we discussed is when was the second time that a brand came out with a perpetual chronograph? And off the top of your head, who else did perpetual chronographs?
I don't know. I literally, was it not until IWC? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it was IWC started doing that. So it was they had a monopoly for decades before other brands were starting to do perpetual chronographs. Yes. So it's amazing how this design DNA was just so cutting edge for the brand and for the industry.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not until the 80s or 90s you see it proliferate throughout the industry.
Yeah. And then IWC kind of the look. I have in front of us, we're actually going to look together at your article so we could hit on some key talking points. And one of the things I love that you did is you added collector's tips along the way. Some things that collectors really should look at when they're looking at a watch, looking at a 3970. And your first one was double checking the language of the calendar disc, which is, I have to say, one of the most common things that people don't notice. Yeah. They're like, well, what are these letters on the letter? So I know in your experience, have you seen many different languages show up at auction or in your journeys?
There are 4 or 5 different languages, right?
Yes.
German, French, English, Italian, Spanish.
Italian,
okay. And then, did you say French is probably the rarest, but English is probably the most
English
in
is
demand?
The most common.
Yeah. Okay. English is the most common. Okay. Gotcha.
But I would say followed by French, and I don't have data to back this up, but just based on my experience. So English followed by French, and then you see Spanish very rarely, German very rarely, but the Italian ones pop up from time to time, which makes sense considering the era these were sold.
Of course.
I love the Italian ones. I think it's just kind of I don't know. I'm half Italian, so that speaks.
Me
to
too.
So
Me too.
There you go. All right. The movement. We're not going to dig too deep into the 2770Q, but do you have any comments on the movement in your research that you'd like to share?
Just that it's beautiful. And I think as we were talking about with the modern vintage, it is, this and the 5970 that came after it are kind of I don't want to say the last in a lineage because it's still used by some brands today, but it's kind of the ultimate expression of that Lemania-based caliber that was invented in the 30s or 40s, used in the Speedmaster, and used by so many different makers. But this is the ultimate expression of it. Patek Philippe finishing it to their standards is kind of what the brand and the manufacturer does best, right?
And I think that the Lemania calibers have kind of a romantic appeal. Exactly. Some people are surprised that are kind of new to collecting the base caliber, the Evoche, wasn't made by Patek Philippe. So there's the classic in-house, or was it outsourced? But with the 3970 and of course its predecessors, like the 2499, the Valjoux calibers, it's like perfectly accepted in the Patek Philippe collecting world. It's just kind of one of those fun, footnotes in history that's a reality. And today you have mostly in-house at Patek Philippe, in particular perpetual chronographs, and people are excited about that, but they're certainly spending more money on the predecessors that had outsourced movements.
Right. So. Well, as we'll get into with the case maker and dial maker as well, it's Patek Philippe bringing the best of Switzerland into one watch, and it's the ultimate expression of sort of Swiss watchmaking in that way.
I like that spin. That works.
That's right.
So let's go back. Good segue to the 1990s. I still laugh. My kids call it, they're always asking about the 1900s and what it was like. I mean, most of us remember the 1900s. So what was going on in the watch industry in the 1990s, and how did the 3970 kind of fit into that storyline?
This is where I drew on you a lot because obviously the quartz crisis had come in the 70s and early 80s, but by the mid 80s, and then especially 1989 and the 150th anniversary of Patek Philippe, as you explained to me, felt like a real inflection point for the brand when they came out with the Caliber 89. It sold for millions of dollars, and it put the brand and Swiss watchmaking on the map again in a way that it had really struggled for the 2 decades previous. And it really set it up to have newfound success, I would say, in the 1990s. We see it in the production numbers of the 3970, 3940, for example. They really start to increase in the 90s. We see more references in the 90s. So Patek Philippe as a brand starts to become more successful, but the Swiss watch industry more broadly is still figuring out how to recover from the quartz crisis. And as you pointed out to me, the 3970 5004 would have been perhaps 2 of the most expensive commercial production watches at the time in the 90s, which means they weren't an easy sell.
In the early 2000s, I specifically remember working at Patek Philippe how difficult they were to sell. And we had so many of them available in all colors, and also had 5004s in all colors just sitting there waiting for a purchaser. And it was a price point issue. It was too expensive. And I've asked similar questions to Tanya because she was working for Patek Philippe in the 1990s, and she saw the increased demand for these kind of watches, but it wasn't like it was today. Right. It was just a different era. And one thing we discussed, and it's also in your article, is that how anything would be done for Patek Philippe to sell said 3970s. And most famously today is taking 5004 Arabic dials and putting them on 3970 dials in order to make the sale, if that's what a client asked. And that was done by Patek Philippe. And you pointed out some that showed up at auction.
Right.
And it's just something we need to know that happened 25, 30 years ago, and it was considered normal course of business.
Yeah. It's a reason there's no hard and fast rules, I guess, right? You mentioned the price, but do you remember kind of what the price was in the early 2000s?
Oh, wow. Under 100,000. I'm thinking more like 89 for yellow gold is like the number that's in my mind, retail. So they, and what's amazing, if you look at, with the exception of the recent run up in prices that we've seen with 3970s, they've been very stable for a good 20 years. It was kind of like the just under $100,000 watch, and that is now changing very quickly.
Do you recall, would they give discounts to people to try to sell them back in those days, or was it still full freight?
The retailers would definitely discount back then.
Okay.
It was, I don't think it is a problem today, but it was a problem back then.
Yeah.
So the margins were generous. The retailer had a nice chunk of change that they were going to make if they sold the watch. And if they had to discount 15, 20%, sometimes even 25%, I'm going back 20 years.
Yeah.
That was typical. Yeah. And just the fact that a perpetual chrono would need to be discounted 20% to make a sale, I feel like it's a horrible thing to say, but that was the reality. Yeah. At that time period.
Long before waitlist, huh?
Yes. Yeah, much. It was a different era back in the 1900s. So I'm just going to go through your article. One comment, we put on the site one of my favorite Patek Philippe advertisements from, I believe it was late 1990s.
That's right, yeah.
Where it has a woman diving in, and we're going to show it in the video, trying to save a man drowning. And then in the next slide, it's a 4-page advertisement. You'll see the man drowning, and she has the 3970 in her mouth that she took from his wrist in order to survive. I don't know. You've seen a lot of Patek Philippe ads. Does that one speak to you?
It does. Well, does it speak to me? I'm not sure if it speaks to me, but
on a personal level, is it?
You had a couple of them in your office yesterday, right? Mm-hmm. And they're bigger than I realized. I mean, it's a full 4-page spread, I think, which is cool, which I had perhaps not quite comprehended before.
This is what happens when a French marketing firm works hand in hand with Patek Philippe. This would not have come out of Switzerland, without a doubt. Yeah. I mean, I'm still trying to find the story behind this ad, because I know there's a great story behind that ad. It's just absolutely
you need to find
fantastic.
That one for sure, yeah.
Before we dive into the series, let's talk a little bit about condition. So, and I encourage people to, of course, visit the site to read the article, because Tony goes into depth of analyzing condition, starting with the dial, the case, and of course the movement. But any things along your research journey that come to mind that you'd like to share about how to assess a 3970?
I think in general, the thing I recall, or the thing I realize, is just the extent to which folks like you, dealers and collectors, are starting to analyze condition of the 3970 in the way they would a true vintage watch from the era prior. And by that, I mean looking at the dial for signs of cleaning, like literally looking at the calendar apertures to see if they feel sharp or softer. Same thing, of course, with the case and polishing. I mean, the 3970 has these beautiful stepped lugs, and after a couple of polishes, they can start to look a little softer. These are all questions that you don't necessarily think about you look at them in modern watches, but not to the extent that you would in a vintage watch, and how it might impact the value or the price of that watch. And I think the lesson for me was just the extent to which we're taking the principles of vintage Patek Philippe collecting and starting to apply it to this era of neo-vintage.
And well said. And it was also very forgiving in the past, maybe not today, that when you sent a 3970 in for service, Patek Philippe, as part of their regular service, would often replace the hands, because the hands typically oxidize over time. And as part of their procedure, they just replace the hands, and also the calendar hands and the date hands. Now I'm noticing collectors are really trying to determine which hands are original and which are service hands. We didn't get into that in the article because I think it's just part of like the life cycle of a watch. Certain pieces are sometimes replaced, but it's just fun to know.
Yeah.
And so we're starting to look at these. I like how you put it, and we're looking at these as vintage watches.
Yeah. I don't want to open a Pandora's box, but something I didn't even end up including in the article, but I went down a whole rabbit hole of was the chronograph hands, both on the 3970 and the 5004, the eras of them, the service hands of them. I didn't come up with firm enough answers, nor do I think they are out there yet, but it's something that if you really want to explore, you could.
That's Pandora's box. Save that for another time. So, and then case hallmarks too. We scratched the surface. You scratched the surface in this article about hallmarks and the classic outside hallmark question around the second series. We'll get into that as we dive into the series, and I think that kicks off our discussion of the first series of the 3970. Just an overall comment. Now, the series of 3970s is something that collectors have defined. Patek Philippe never in a catalog said, this is the first series, second series, third series, fourth series. This is just how the collecting community tries to make sense of the changes that were made along the way. And as you pointed out earlier, there's a lot of blurred lines between the series. There's a lot of exceptions to the rule. Patek Philippe often took pieces or parts from earlier batches. And it's just very important to underline the point that we're about to discuss series, but this is, it is based in fact, but there's also so many exceptions to the rule. Yeah. Would you like to comment on that?
I have a question for you that I guess
Sure.
I just am wondering if you could expand on a little bit, since this is something that's defined by collectors and dealers. And
yes.
You've been active in the market for the entirety of the time, I suppose, that this has become defined by those types of people. When do you kind of start to recall people identifying a first, second, third, fourth series, and then folks, collectors coming to you and saying, I want a first series, I want a second series 3970? When do you start to see that differentiation happening?
It's definitely after 2010. It's interesting because the same thing happened with 2499s. If you look at old auction catalogs, whether it was a first series, a coveted first series, or a later series, like nobody noticed or really cared. Some had square buttons, some had round push buttons. Yeah. Nobody cared. Now with 3970s, it's still very recognizable once you train your eye, but not on surface value. On the first look, I mean, a 3970 looks like a 3970. And while I was working at Patek Philippe up to like 20, nobody paid any attention to the differences of series. It just didn't, no one even thought about it. And even when I went back into the auction world, now we're going to like 2011, 12, 13, it was just starting, but I would say 99% of the collecting community didn't know, didn't care. This is kind of a post-2015 storyline. So we're talking the last 10 years that people are paying attention to the series and the series differences. And I think it's of course, the internet. It's because we're able to compare and contrast in ways that we haven't before. And more people are looking at the differences between series in an obsessive way than ever before. Like I have people saying, I specifically want a second series XYZ, or I want a fourth series for this reason. And this is unusual to see something so recent in the development of like Patek Philippe watch collecting.
It's fascinating for me to see it happen in real time with these types of watches. I kind of came into the world with the Paul Newman or the 2499 kind of fully formed, more or less, right? So for it to happen in real time as I've been active in media has been interesting to watch.
Now, the one series that people easily knew was important for some time is the first series of 3970s because it has a snapback. Now, the amount of emotion around the snapback is it's more than I ever imagined, and I'm going to share this. Excuse me. I share the story with our listeners because speak about real time. This just happened when this article was published just a few weeks ago. You created a chart, which was based on the data from our conversations and also from an incredible book called The Dial by Dr. Helmut Krod. which I highly, highly, highly encourage everyone to have this book. And I'm going to do a pitch. It's available on watch print out of Switzerland. You could still buy a copy of Dr. Krotz's book. And I think it's the best by miles book about dials, dial production, and specifically Patek Philippe dials that you can have. So using the data from Krotz's book, you created a chart that we agreed to put on the site from day one. And it was all good until about 10 hours after it was out on the website. I was getting almost threats via text based on what data was in the chart around specifically the first series and production numbers. And as I told you yesterday, I own this problem because I told you at that point, I was like, let's be safe and say there was 100 snapbacks in the first series, and there was another 100 snapback 3971s, which is the sapphire snapback, because no one knows the actual numbers. So what I completely underestimated was the emotional response of how many 3970s were made, and our guesstimate based on what the market and some particular collectors think. So with some very fiery phone calls and texts, I was like, Tony, we got to take the chart down immediately. I think it was out for an hour, and people were like screenshotting the chart of the guesstimate of production numbers. I spoke to, and we're going to share some of this information. In my opinion, there's one collector who does not want to share his name. He's an American who has I think the most knowledge on first and second series 3970s in the world. So I called him up in the States and I was like, all right, what's the deal? How many 3970s first series are out there? And he took me through the two different schools of thought. There's the case number way of looking at it, where you could guesstimate how many were made, or the movement number theory of how many were made. If you go by movement number, it's possible that there's 200. If you go by case, most likely there was less than 100. So, but looking at all the data and digging into this, we came to the mutual conclusion, and this is my opinion now, there's less than 100 of all first series, including the sapphire back and the solid snapback. So I think that's kind of the safe number to use. There's most likely under 100, but I can't emphasize enough, only Patek Philippe knows. This is just our opinion based on back to market coefficients.
That's right. That's what I was going to add. I've kind of been tracking the first series that we've seen appear at auction, and I think it kind of lends some credibility to what you're saying. But I also haven't documented enough second series to kind of back into it that way as well. But I understand exactly what you're saying. I agree with it.
So we're saying on the market, we're saying on the record today, there's most likely less than 100 first series. Everyone's happy. I'll stop receiving threats of people that think that there might be 200, but who knows? Maybe there's a batch that Patek Philippe will sell someday. We'll see. You never know what's in the back room. So that's the chart storyline around the first series, and I encourage people to come see the article to read about the first series and some of the nuances about the dial, about the era, and about the aesthetics that you could see on the site today. We're looking at a picture now of a 3970 first series. That is a beautiful, beautiful watch. To me, this is a vintage watch. I mean, just if compared to later series, this truly looks like a vintage watch.
I think the two-tone dial especially, we were talking about the modern vintage thing, but first series in particular feel warm, two-tone, truly vintage, especially with the snapback cases. And the later series, as we'll get to, the dials get a little bit brighter and feel a little bit more modern.
It's interesting too. There's a lot of debate around how 3970 first series in particular dial should age. And for our listeners, and if you don't know this already, there's an organic compound that's put on the dial called Zapon, which is the final layer of varnish. A different varnish was used on the subdials, on the perpetual dial, and on the 24-hour dial that often ages in a different way with a different type of finish, which leads sometimes to a darker look than the rest of the dial. So like in the Rolex community, everyone's looking at how things age over time. Same is true with Patek Philippe collecting. Yep. And the 3970 dials, sometimes it feels like there's no rhyme or reason of how they age, because you just never know how time how light and how these organic compounds are going to change the look of the watch over time.
And that two-tone effect is very much associated with first series, but do you see that going over into second series as well?
Sometimes you could see like in this picture we're looking at is a very light tone difference. Yeah. But when I occasionally see like a new old stock 3970, or it's true, like 3942, that hasn't been subjected to any light. Sometimes they don't show any aging whatsoever, where it's a very monochrome look. So that doesn't mean there's a problem with the watch. It just means it hasn't been subjected to light. It's really interesting, and it's a bit subjective too. We don't know how these things are going to age over time.
Yeah.
We don't know how they're going to look in 20 or 30 years too. So, but it's kind of nice to see two-tone. I love the two-tone first series is just absolutely beautiful.
There's nothing like it. I agree.
Yeah. All right, moving on to the second series. So this is we're talking 1987 to 1990. What's the main differentiation with a second series?
Well, they go from the snap-on casebacks to screw-on casebacks, which means that they change reference to E, and then the gold, E standing for étanché.
Correct.
Your French is probably better than mine.
Not much better.
Meaning waterproof or water resistant. Screwback cases, and you'll see them with, I want you to talk about this a little bit actually,
Sure.
But you'll see them with solid or sapphire, or perhaps both, right?
What we normally see is just one back. Okay. You see the solid screw back. But what we're starting to figure out, especially when you're getting towards 89 to 1990, these like late second series, they often come with two backs. At first, and we sometimes see some pieces as early as late 1980s, so a client could request that second back because they wanted to see the movement. And so they wanted to have that sapphire back. So you see second series that actually have two backs, which is really, really nice to have both. But if I see one that's like I'm buying from the original owner and it just has one back and his box and papers and everything, that's perfectly normal. There's a good chance it wasn't born with two backs. And that's different than when we get to the third and fourth series.
Yeah. But other than that, it has a lot of the same features. It has the same hands, the same dial markers, simple square markers, and everything else is fairly similar except for the fact that they also start to make it in metals besides yellow gold, so that you see the classic sort of quartet of precious metals as well. And I think production goes from, as we say, about 100 to about 650, I think is the estimate for the second series, the most generally accepted. And the numbers get very small for the white metals, but in general, it's kind of much more common to see a second series than a first series, but it's still a rare watch compared to the later series, as we'll get into.
And for those that aren't staring at these all the time, I'm just going to point out first and second series have like the squared batons, as opposed to the batons that have like the angled, faceted batons, and the leaf hands, or the, forgive my French, the fouille hands. So that is something that really distinguishes the first and second series. So when you see a second series, it looks a bit more modern, especially in terms of the case with the screw back, but it still has that aesthetic of the first series. So that late 80s transition is very desirable in the market today.
And it looks nice on your wrist too.
Yes, I'm actually wearing a rose gold 3970 with the second series with a German calendar today. And yes, I don't know. Wearing a 3970 is just magic.
I feel like you could conquer the world, huh?
Conquer the world wearing this. I don't speak a word of German, but
That's right.
That calendar, I think it's kind of part of that storyline of the watch. And it came from a German retailer. It's part of the story.
Yeah.
This timepiece.
I really like the second series. I think we've seen prices go up a lot in the past, even just the past months, as we'll talk about, I'm sure. But the other thing I think that we've talked about a little bit is we give these windows of production years, but there seems to also be a fair amount of overlap. Second series being made when first series were also being made. And then we were talking yesterday, I think we've seen papers even as late as, say, 1992 for second series. We cite 1990 as kind of the end of the production run, but it kind of gets back to what we were talking about at the top, where these things were sitting around in cases for years oftentimes. So it kind of just tells the story of the era once again.
And the overlap is very important to know because the secret codes that you see are those 4 letter marks in the bottom left-hand corner of a Patek Philippe cert. And by the way, collectability has the key to those secret date codes, so that you could actually look at your certificate of origin and know when that watch was sold originally. And this is my important point on this. You'll see on the papers the date that the watch originally left the factory. As we pointed out earlier, sometimes they sat around for a few years. They didn't just fly out the door. So you have to recognize that you're looking at a document when it left the factory, not necessarily knowing when the watch was produced. And that is very important. Interestingly, extracts from the archive sometimes share more information than the certificates of origin in the world of Patek Philippe. I like to sometimes have both. So you'll see a piece, for example, that clearly is a second series, but it was dated as originally sold in 1992. You get the extract and you'll be like, oh, that's interesting. It was made in 1989 and made in 1990. It's just part of the story of the watch. So.
Yeah.
All right. Moving on to the third series. This is, as you pointed out, after 1989, things started happening in the world of complicated Patek Philippe watches. After the Art of Patek Philippe exhibition happened in 89, after the Calibre 89 sale, people were looking to complicated Patek Philippe watches. They're looking at them in a different way. And the factory answered the call and they made more of them because it's good business and there was more demand. What differentiates a third series from a second series?
The things I look at, you can kind of tell on its face. Number one, the leaf-shaped hands go to square hands, or how do you describe them?
I'd say they're like bulleted baton hands. They faceted pointed batons.
Which kind of match the faceted hour markers. Mm-hmm. And then if you look at photos, sometimes it's hard to tell on the internet, but in person you can tell there's just a brighter white, I feel, when they're the standard opaline silver dial as compared to the first and second series. I think those are kind of the primary attributes I look at. And then this is one you wouldn't necessarily catch in initial photos, but they all I think are supposed to come with 2 case backs by the third series.
Yes. By the third series, 2 case backs. And I just learned, I mentioned that that gentleman who's the guru of first and second series 3970 taught me something last week, which blows my mind. And I'm sharing it with you and our listeners for the first time.
Okay.
So if you look closely at this third series, let's see how this, of course it covers it. This might be better to look at it at this. This is a second series. You'll notice on the calendar between 31 and 1 that there's a dot. Here, I'm going to go back. Let's find a picture of a second series. Okay, here's a good one. So you'll notice on the dot between 31 and 1, this is only seen on first and second series. With the third and fourth series, there's no dot between the 31 and 1.
Oh, okay.
Once you see that, you can't unsee it, and it's changed my life. So here, I'm just pulling up another example of So there's
a later one. Yeah.
So here's the third series, and you'll see there's no dot between the 31 and 1.
Ah.
So I have to thank the guru for sharing that little tidbit with me, and I think that might get the 3970 community talking. That's because everyone's gonna be running and checking their dials for that little dot. So
that's funny. I can't believe I didn't notice that.
Yeah, I've just never seen it in my life. Now, the fourth series, there's not a huge differentiation from the third series. Is there any difference in your opinion?
The acrylic goes to a sapphire, I think, is the main difference, and then we're looking at a photo of a black dial. I think you start to see those in the fourth series, so production differences like that. But beyond that, there's not a ton of changes. The easiest way to know a fourth series, as I think you told me, is to look at the movement in the case number and check it against the dial, which you'll have picked up from watchprint.com at this point.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really about when the watch was made, the movement in the case number, which distinguishes a third versus a fourth series. And I'm debating whether we put that chart back up, amended. I don't know. What do you think? Should we put it in the article?
We can put it up. Maybe we'll remove the production numbers so that people can't can't get that at a quick glance and they have to read the entire copy. But I think it's a useful thing for people to have all in one place, and you can easily distinguish the different series. And we'll also mention the little dot trick that you just taught us.
Yeah, the little dot. It's just
got to add that to the chart.
That this morning I was like, before this discussion, I was like looking through as many pictures of 3970s as possible to see if I could find any exceptions to the dot. We know there'll be exceptions if we keep looking. So that's just kind of that's life. Wow. So we just finished up the 4th series, and I think that covers it. Before we segue into the market itself, just a comment. Since this article came out, the market has changed on 3970s. So we're going to call it the Tony Traina bump. It's incredible how scholarship, or when people put these watches under a microscope, can change the values and the demand. And you've seen this a number of times in the watch market. What are you seeing now in the 3970 market based on feedback that you've received?
I think it's the collectability bump. I would never like to take solo credit. I think it takes at least a few people to sort of change a market. And I think especially a watch like the 3970, it's a big enough market that it takes no one alone can influence a market that's this big. We're talking 4,000 watches, and there's, as I say, 20 to 40 on the market at any given time. Substantially few of those, when you look at them, are actually what I would call sort of long-term collectible. But it's a big enough market that I don't think any one person or two people, as much as we might try, could sort of impact the market substantially. That said, I think the early series, 3970s in particular, have really seen an increase in the past since we published this article, but you can trace the trend line back farther than that even. I put in here the results we saw from the last 12 months, and there was one that sold for about 280,000 at the beginning of 2024, and that was
first series.
Right? These are all first series. And then I think the one that really put it on everyone's radar was the one that sold for more than $400,000 at Philippe's Hong Kong towards the end of 2024.
November. Yes.
And that felt like a stepwise change in the market. And then the Tom Brady watch that sold for a mere $312,000 felt like a bit of a reality check. I think people thought that might go crazy, sell for $500,000 or something like that. But it was kind of a reality check. But most of the questions I seem to be fielding or getting are people that are interested in first series and now second series, and people realizing how rare and special those watches are, as we talked about, feeling like real vintage Patek Philippe's in a way.
And I like how you put it, that the Phillips result breaking 400,000. Yeah, that felt like the whole shift was occurring, because all of a sudden I kind of think of the number 350 as kind of like the old 2499 number, like for a third series in particular. So now all of a sudden we're seeing 3970s get into 2499 price territory, and anything is possible. Yeah. And I do expect the next time we see a first series, and we probably will see some this season, a new price point, because so many people, we keep like a hunt list, are asking us for one now. People want them. And then they're asking for second series. Like, I'd say that's like second on our list. It'll be fun to see what happens.
I don't even know if I were you, if I were collectability, if I were able to take in a first series as a private dealer, I don't even know what I would be listing it at right now. I'm curious to see the next one that comes to auction, what the price what the market will realize for it. Because it feels like it could be 350, it could be 450, it could be anything, especially if it's if there's a little extra sauce on top, some sort of provenance or other story, or if it's a exceptionally full set, or if it's fresh to market. There are still so many to be discovered. I think there will be some exciting discoveries in 3970 land in the next few years.
Speaking of special sauce, there are some special 3970s made along the way. Two that you pointed out in your article, of course, the Doré dials and also bracelet 3970s. You care to comment on those?
We talk a little bit about the special watches 3970s, both, I would say, unintentionally and then intentionally special. What I mean by that is the unintentionally special ones were watches that were ostensibly general production watches, like as you mentioned, a Doré dial, kind of that warm, golden hued dial that you see in early 3940s. I believe there are 6 known Doré 3970s, and I'm not sure if those are all even original or if some are later added by clients. I'm not sure how many would extract or archive if you requested it, but I find the watches to be beautiful.
Aesthetically,
they call to mind the
so
3940s. They're my favorite, not only for the beauty of them, but also the kind of the story or the charm of the idea of anyone that's sort of well-to-do in the 1990s being able to walk in and just kind of buy one because they thought it was a beautiful thing. The later ones that we'll get to that are kind of special commissions for clients or whatever else the story might have been are also can be quite beautiful. Breguet numerals, special scales, but when it's manufactured rarity for its own sake, sometimes it's not as exciting to me.
Yeah. It's so exciting to see. Like here's a 3971 with a Doré or champagne dial. It's so beautiful.
Yeah.
That monochrome look is very exciting, and we've seen the 3940 market just skyrocket when you have the Doré dial.
Yeah.
And the 3970, we just haven't seen enough on the marketplace to distinguish price points.
Yep. And then I know you asked about the bracelet as well.
Yes.
Because I know it's one of your favorites. I think it's because you're a big Jay-Z fan, and we know
Huge fan. Yes.
He's been wearing the 24.99 on bracelet and has become a trendsetter in that world. When I was at Collectability HQ, you had the 3970 on bracelet. It's not my aesthetic, but I think you're just sort of you're more refined gentleman than I am at this point.
It's too kind. I appreciate bracelet watches so much. I do think Patek Philippe's made some of the best bracelet watches in history. Piaget, especially some of their latest pieces, gives a good argument, but the breadth of what Patek Philippe's bracelet production has been throughout the last 80 years is extraordinary to me. So when I see a 3970 on a bracelet that's factory original, it makes my heart skip. Would I wear it? Occasionally. It's not an everyday watch to wear this big chunk of gold on your wrist, but they're complete works of art. Yeah. And I'm very excited to see there's more interest for people wearing bracelet watches than at least in recent memory than I've seen before.
And objectively rare things that the price does not reflect their rarity because of the niche that it is. So if you're into it, if you're into the aesthetic, I don't want to say it's a value, but it's some place to look at.
It's a relative value compared to a strap watch, which is interesting because the retail prices were easily 30 to 50% higher originally with a bracelet. But on the market today, they often bring 30 to 50% less.
Right.
But that's changing very, very quickly.
That's interesting.
So, you mentioned some of the special commemorative and special clients that had 3970s made for them. Care to comment on a couple of the ones that capture your attention?
I feel like this is basically the Eric Clapton effect, right?
Yes.
He adding that 12 Breguet numeral at top is beautiful and harkens back to some of the vintage Patek Philippe design cues that make folks like us go crazy. They would also often add a tachymeter scale, other small tweaks, making these metal and dial combinations that kind of make people drool, salmon dials and white gold or platinum cases. This is stuff of collector fodder, and we've seen those probably sell for the most prices. I think the record price for a 3970 was a Clapton commission. I think it was a salmon dial in a white metal.
Watch. Yes.
Yeah, there you go. And they're beautiful watches, and then we've seen sort of imitators, I think, of those as well. But they are beautiful, and that gets us to the Saatchi dials or the Saatchi commissions as well. Come 2015, kind of a decade after the 3970 was ostensibly retired. But I think Clapton is kind of the trendsetter in this regard.
And just a comment on that, no one from Patek Philippe has ever confirmed that the Saatchi dials were made as a direct result of what they saw happening with the Clapton watches at auction. But to me, it makes sense. They saw these pieces that were specially made for certain clients from that 2005, even a little before era, bring huge prices at auction. And then all of a sudden, we start seeing these Saatchi watches bringing those pieces that were so-called unique, and they're making them 5 at a time for the market for VIP clients to celebrate that London exhibition. So it is kind of fun to see. Yeah, is the tail wagging the dog, or how's that phrase go? It's interesting to see how things changed.
It's interesting. It's interesting to hear of a brand kind of or to think of them interacting with the market like that. And it's not just them capitalizing on the market. It is a way to give some of their best clients a watch like that too, right?
I think it's true. I think this is the era, because that's when I was there. I remember that we would just say over and over again, no celebrities are made any special watches. It's like all the clients are equal. Yeah, all of a sudden you'd see like this VIP have this piece that was made as a one-off. Yeah. I think around 2010, that changed. There was just no more of these one-offs. And I think Saatchi was an example of making, they weren't one-offs anymore, but these very rare pieces in small numbers for a small amount of clients. So it kind of opened up the pool of potential buyers.
Interesting.
But whenever we see these at auction, they all just bring crazy prices. Yeah. It's really exciting when these things pop up.
Yeah, so they're gorgeous to see. That's for sure.
As we wrap up, we discussed condition, but we should discuss completeness. When you buy a 3970, what do you want to see it accompanied with? Ideally,
especially in the later series, I think full set is what adds to the collectability. Mm-hmm. Beyond condition, it's good to see, especially in the early years, the original box. I think, as you call it, the flaky box, because the leather gets kind of flaky, and I think those were the original boxes until 1989, 1990. But you want to see, besides the case backs, you want to see the stylus, the box, the papers. We talked about the papers a little bit, but even checking the spring bars, I think a lot of times the original precious metal spring bars get replaced. But if you see little things like that, it's kind of it's a nice to have, and it adds to the lore of your 3970.
And having the full package, it's nice. And there's a premium for it. They bring significantly more money when you have everything.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. We talked about this. You kind of had to prioritize condition first, though, still, right? As someone I think said to me, you can't wear box and papers, right?
Well said. So, and some people just want to have a 3970 on their wrist. Mm-hmm. And why pay an extra $50,000 for box and papers that you're going to put away in a vault? Yep. It's important if you intend on selling it, but some people, I have collectors say, I'm fine with the archive. I'm going to wear the watch, and life is good. And I've just seen so many tragic stories of extra case backs, styluses, and papers separated permanently, in many cases destroyed through flood or fire, sadly, or theft, or most commonly divorce, and they never make it back to the watch. And so, yes, safeguard those extra bits and pieces if you have them. So, wow. Closing thoughts on the 3970. This is incredible because in less than an hour, we are covering so much information on such an important reference. And I do encourage people to dig into this article and reach out if they have any questions or thoughts. But closing thoughts on the 3970. What has this whole experience taught you?
I think something it's taught me is, first of all, it helped me learn about this era of Patek Philippe and just think about the era of Patek Philippe and then all of Swiss watchmaking in a way I kind of hadn't before. And a lot of the fun of watches for me is thinking about how they're a reflection of a certain moment in history for Swiss watchmaking, for the brand, for culture or society. Mm-hmm. And it's fun to just place the 3970 in that context, especially because it's a watch where I was at least alive in the 1990s, so I can kind of pull little memories from my mind or my childhood years as well, and think that there's this crazy watch that existed in the world at the same time that Mr. Reardon was working every day trying to sell. So that part of it is really fun. But I also just it's funny when I publish one of these articles, I talk to you and a couple of other collectors that I know have these watches or love them. But as soon as you publish something like this, people start coming out of the woodwork to give their opinions on a 3970 and show their example. And they've got these little minute questions about the details. And I start to learn even more about the watch in a way, or see more examples of it. And I think I probably could have written another couple thousand words just on the second series and documenting all of the examples we've seen, to really get into the breakdown of metals and really talking about the calendar discs and the moon phase and how that evolves over all of the series. But then specifically, like the first and second series are where collectors are really looking now. And I think there are still, if not unanswered questions, there's a certain fuzziness that you can't necessarily answer all of the questions. But if you're a collector, you kind of do have to have a point of view, number one, on how things should look, and then what you consider valuable. And that's the entire fun of collecting.
Wow, well said. And I'm going to come back to something you teased earlier in this conversation. You most likely have your dream 3970. Can you tell us what that watch is? It could be anything.
For me, we talked about the Dore dial 3970s. Mm-hmm. That's the one for me. Again, just the story of the fact that they were out there in the 1990s, and just apparently not that many people seem to have bought them. An early, a second series 3970 with a Dore dial would be the one for me. And as soon as it comes out of my mouth on the Collectability podcast, I regret it, because to the extent anyone, the market included, cares about what we have to say, they just went up another couple $1,000s.
See, look what you've done.
What about you? What's yours?
For me, the dream would be a first series, but with the JPH stamp, with Jean-Pierre Hagman casemaker mark.
Yeah.
I haven't found one yet. Okay. It likely exists.
Okay.
And what's so cool is there's probably someone that has a 3970 or 3971 now that has his stamp on it and doesn't even know. And that to me would be a dream 3970.
Do you have any, because you mentioned this to me, do you have any additional background as to why he made some of the cases?
The only thing I know is that there was always a little friction within the management of Patek Philippe of whether or not he could put his initials on what he made. Early on, it was fine. So yes, in the 80s, there's probably some cases that actually I know of other references that have his initials, but a 3970 would be quite special to have that. So I want to thank you so much, Tony, for joining us today, and I also very much look forward to your next article that you're writing for Collectability. Can you share with our listeners a little hint of what you might be working on?
Well, as we sort of had our informal meeting yesterday at Collectability HQ, I think we're going to be looking at the first serially produced Patek Philippe watch. It measures 31 millimeters, depending on how your calipers are adjusted, and I think it'll be coming out soon.
Excellent, and I think our astute listeners might comment below what reference that might be.
Right.
Thank you again, Tony, for your time today and for all your work on this incredible article. And I want to thank our listeners for joining us today, whether you're listening on podcasts or watching on YouTube. We really appreciate it. Please like and subscribe on the platform of your choice. And this is John Reardon for Collectability.